advanced society. But that ideology of freedom and freedom of choice and consumer sovereignty masks the fact that there's domination in production, right? To take the old, the old mold to talk about Marx. In chapter 6 of volume 1 of Capital, he says, yes, we're free to choose which capitalist, he calls the capitalists Mr. Moneybags, which Mr. Moneybags we might work for if there are jobs to go around, right? If there's a tight labor market. You also often can choose to work with the structural employment. So you can choose Mr. Moneybags. But once you enter the realm of production, Mr. Moneybags kicks your ass. He says that once the worker who's confident when they choose where they're going to work gets into the factory itself or the workplace, they become timid and neurotic and very kind of fearful because they know that they're your boss and that the boss has the power to fire you. Now, the United States is the only country in the advanced post-industrial capitalist world where most workers can be fired at will. As long as your employer doesn't say they're firing you because of your gender or your race or your age. In fact, in most parts of the United States, they can say I'm firing you because you're gay and lesbian or queer and I don't like you. Right? There's no federal anti-discrimination law covering employment for gay and lesbian people. They can fire you literally. If you're not in a union with grievances, and only 13% of American workers are in the union, they can fire you because they don't like your body odor. They can fire you for whatever reason they want because you're hired at the will of the employer. It's the only country in the world. We do not have, if we're going to talk about quote last week night, I can tell you all the weaknesses of the European social democratic model, but most European workers, particularly in Northern Europe, do have certain rights in the workplace, either guaranteed by unions or by law. It's hard to fire people in much of Europe, right? In the United States, they can fire you for whatever reason. I can tell you all the weaknesses of the German model, but one reason why the 23% of jobs in Germany are still high-end manufacturing is that German unions, in fact, it doesn't have to be a union, any company in Germany with 50 or more employees, 49%, it is 50% minus 1, of the board of directors are elected by works councils, by the workers. And they sit on the board of directors and the books are open and they have the exact information that the corporation has, that the pro-corporate, pro-capitalist directors have. So when they claim we have to move our Volkswagen plant to the Czech lands because we can't make a profit, the unions can say, but look, you are making a profit, we can prove it in the books. And most high-end manufacturing, not low-end, there is outsourcing in Germany, but they've kept a lot more industrial jobs. In Scandinavia, and I can tell you, again, the Scandinavian sort of social security model, social wage isn't as strong as it used to be, but it's still very strong. In Scandinavia, you can, in Sweden certainly, it's on the books, in law, even if you're not in a unionized firm. If there's a new health and safety or technology introduced into the workplace, right, and a works council, every workplace has a health and safety council elected by the employees. If that works council says it's a dangerous process, it is immediately stopped, subject to sort of binding arbitration about whether or not this new technology is dangerous, whatever. And if the employer tries to force that new technology, that new dangerous chemical or whatever, to be used by the employees, by the workers, they can call on the police. The workers can call on the police. So to say that the sort of class power, the power of working people in Northern Europe is not as strong as it used to be, but to say that Northern European social democracy has come down to the level of United States and United Kingdom neoliberalism, that is deregulate, anti-union, cut progressive taxation, gut the public sector. Whoever says that is smoking crack. In the sense that, yes, as Steve Max sort of talked about Greece, but the strength of sort of class power in Northern Europe was such that the restrictions on capital, the sort of power of labor was so great, then global sort of neoliberal capital, mobility, global capital has lowered those standards, but from such a high level that, I'll give you another example. In Germany, France, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Benelux for short, Austria, Scandinavia, about 12% of children are born into poverty. But after social programs, universal child care, universal health care, only about 4% of children grow up in poverty in those countries. Usually new immigrants who haven't been fully incorporated. And hence, the big blind spot of Northern European social democracy is it is not great on multicultural integration of immigrants. And there we should be very critical. In other words, if you're inside the welfare system, if you have permanent employment, permanent rights, you're fully a citizen, you're still in pretty good shape if you're working class. But if you're excluded, particularly around immigrant status, around religious status in terms of not being that open on a sort of multicultural level to people from Islamic backgrounds, whatever, there are real problems in the social democratic model, and we should be very critical of that. But only 4% of children in Northern Europe live in poverty. Does anybody know what percentage of American children, according to the government, which is a very minimal definition of poverty, it's much higher, but does anybody know what the official US Census says? 20%? 22%. 22% of American children, according to the US government, it's probably over a third in reality, right? In Northern Europe, only about, in the US, to show you that, quote, social democracy, sometimes by throwing money at problems, solves problems. In the United States, when Michael Harrington in 1962 wrote The Other America, does anybody know what the age group was most poor?
Seniors.
Seniors. 1/3 of senior citizens lived in poverty according to the federal government. Even amidst the greatest recession since the Depression, does anybody know what the official elderly poverty rate is? Official poverty rate now is 15.5, according to the federal government. It's probably like 25 if we really had a real definition. Among the elderly, it's only 9. Right? It was 33. It got down as low as 6 or 7. Because why? Because Social Security under Lyndon Johnson was doubled in its real value, the Great Society. Under that last Keynesian social democratic but imperialist and racist president, Richard Nixon, it was indexed to inflation. Remember, in 1969, Richard Nixon's Council of Economic Advisors issues its annual review of the budget and says, we're all Keynesians now. We all believe in, a strong welfare state, and strong sort of, counter-cyclical spending. When there's unemployment, the government should spend more, whatever. Nixon indexes it to inflation, and also one of the great gains of the Great Society was Medicare. The elderly do have, it's being withered away somewhat, but they have basically universal health care. So we threw money at the wealthy, at the elderly, right? And the right always says you can't, throwing money at problems doesn't solve them. We threw money at the elderly out of progressive taxation, and guess what? It solved the problem to some extent of elderly poverty. It's sort of like the right says, and they have a partial degree of truth. It's like ideology. Education alone can't redress inequality. Right? And in fact, even in the most egalitarian societies, democratic education tends to advantage kids who come from families with high educational capital. Right? And frankly, we have to say that yes, everybody should have a good education in this country. But no matter how your parents or no matter how you do in the educational system, we all should have decent lives and meaningful jobs. There's plenty of meaningful work to go around. And frankly, it's a very cruel system that says that how docile you are and how good you are at giving back what the high school teacher wants at age 15 should determine your fate. We want universal public free education, but we also want job retraining. We want, for the few tenured faculty who are still alive, if sabbaticals are good enough for them, why not for everyone? Shouldn't you be able to retrain later in life? If you were doing, moderate sort of wage service work and you want to become a nurse practitioner, if a guy wants to go back to nursing school or something at age 35, why not 2 years at that point? The point is, it's a very cruel society, even a meritocratic sort of equality of opportunity capitalist system that says that the people who win in the educational system or the people who win in the labor market, they should have great lives, and the losers should have bad lives. That's dog-eat-dog world. That's crazy. We have double productivity in the last 30 years, right? And one thing to think about, the changes in capitalism, from 47 to 73, productivity in this country doubled. Does anybody know what happened to the average family wage?
It went down.
No, that's the last, that's from, you're living from 73 on. From 47 to 73.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah.
What happened? It didn't go up as fast for people of color, although it began to accelerate in the 60s. It went up 90%. Basically, the economy grew and everyone's sort of wealth and income grew with it, right? That's because there were strong unions, there were industrial jobs, and just as men of color, disproportionately men, got industrial jobs in auto and steel and petrochemical and rubber, in the 70s, de-industrialization comes, right? And people start losing good jobs, good union jobs. Now, productivity, again, has doubled from 1977 to today, right? But does anybody know what happened to the real family wage?
do it now.
Well, you're close. The wage of the average male wage earner did go down about 7–9% in real terms, only because of the massive entry of women into the workforce. Productivity doubles, but the average family income only goes up 9%. 100% productivity gain, 47 to 73, 90% gain in average family income, 100% gain in productivity and in GDP in real terms from about 79 to today. And the real family wage goes up 9%, but the average hours worked by that family goes up about 300 hours because women, you need two incomes now. Hint, one of the greatest, and Charles Murray, again, it's a crazy book, but there's a slight degree of truth to this. If you're a lower income, less educated man of any race, any immigrant status in this country, there aren't good industrial jobs. You're not going to make high wages, right? Unless we unionize service work, unionize hotel work, retail trade, restaurant,
What about oil workers?
What?
Oil workers.
Well, oil workers, but that's the last of sort of semi-skilled, that's like the last kind of industrial job. You have to go to North Dakota, and you have to live in man camps, and it's a pretty, as you know, it can be a pretty violent existence, etc. Yeah, there are, obviously, there still are some industrial jobs, there's still some auto workers, but it's much harder, right? There are only 200,000 auto workers in America today who make as many cars. This is an argument for socializing the wealth we produce. 250,000, counting the transplants. American auto workers today at full production can make 16 million cars a year. In 1970, when we made 12 million cars, the height of the sort of 60s boom, we needed 1.5 million auto workers to make 12 million cars. Robots, computers. And why shouldn't we? The argument for socialism is that, look, production is a socially interdependent form of human activity, right? This idea that only in America do we think Bill Gates created $80 billion worth of real value. Fucking Microsoft has 200,000 employees. You think he designed all the fucking software programs? I mean, he may have designed the first MS-DOS, I don't know. And we should give him a good royalty check, and we should build him a statue, and he's a nice little guy that he gives to charity. But A, to show you the power of social wealth. First of all, $80 billion, we all say, wow, that's a lot of money. Do you realize the collective power of this economy? We're a $15 trillion economy whose federal budget is $3.7 trillion a year. That, last I know, is about 450 times more wealth than fucking Bill Gates is worth. So let's talk about the collective wealth we produce together. And since it is interdependent, produced by all of us, 200,000 Microsoft employees, maybe they ought to have a say in how Microsoft is run. And given that Microsoft used technology from the arms race, from sort of the National Science Foundation, from all the federal funding of scientific work. After all, DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project, whatever, is what funded the internet, email, whatever. Shouldn't we, since we socially funded all this creation of wealth, shouldn't we socially control? I mean, if you come out of anything from this sort of somewhat disjointed talk, what you should remember is the fundamental socialist insight is that not just the wealth, but the social relationships of society are created by social interaction, social cooperation, and yes, sometimes social competition. But, as I think Michael Walzer will probably say in his talk later today, it's stealing from an essay he wrote, which a lot of you should read. It's in, I think, Radical Principles, which is probably most of your library. It's called Town Meetings and Workers' Control. And it's basically the argument for socialism. It's the same argument as democracy. If some sort of social relationships have an impact on you, particularly a binding impact, an enforceable impact on you, this is Rousseau's argument for democracy. If laws have a binding effect on you, the only way they can be legitimate is, anybody know Rousseau's social contract? If they're made through what type of process?
Made by the people.
Right, made democratically, by the people, by popular sovereignty. In other words, we have no, this is King's argument. Why should people of color obey United States laws when they have no voice in making them? Jim Crow is illegitimate. It's not democratic because it had a binding influence on people of African descent in the South who had no voice in the making of these laws. So civil disobedience is legitimate. So that's the argument for political democracy. But economic institutions and other forms of social institutions, neighborhoods, community groups, whatever, often have a binding effect on their membership. Certainly the workplace does, in that you can be hired and fired. And also, the irrationality of capitalism is that though these tasks are interdependent, how we create wealth, how we produce cars, how we produce scientific knowledge, they're done interdependently. The way that it's structured, this is Marx's kind of thing about the way we produce, the forces of production are social and interdependent, but the way they're controlled, the relations of production, the way that this interdependent form of social production, and it doesn't mean just economic, cultural, social, the way it's controlled, the relations of production are very undemocratic and hierarchical, right? So that if economic firms affect the lives of their employees, but also the lives of consumers and the lives of people around the globe, we ought to figure out how to govern those relationships as democratically as possible. Walter says what touches all ought to be decided by all. And then it gets sort of complex, it gets a little complicated. You know, what's the role of consumers? What's the role of, say, citizens of foreign regimes, whatever? That's okay. I mean, if anybody has to go, don't worry about it. And then I'll come to a conclusion in a minute, so we can have a conference discussion. You know, we can talk about what's the relationship with worker-owned firms, how they coordinated, what would be the role of overall planning. But if somebody tells you capitalists don't plan, they just respond to market forces, that's bullshit. I mean, capitalists invest, right? And they create products that they have to create a market for. They don't know. If capitalists didn't plan, then why do they spend so much time on advertising and marketing? They've made a decision to produce a new iPod, they have to sell it to you. And they try to manipulate sort of market. They do plan, but also any capitalist regime that's going to be effective and efficient, and hint, we may have a capitalist class that's so global and so into making money from money, they no longer understand how to produce real material goods that are valuable. Any decent capitalist society has had to have public investment from the get-go. Public education, public armies. I mean, I hate to say it, but how did European capitalism get going? It was the state putting people in Africa into chains, and it was the state forcing indigenous people in Latin America to die in the mines to get the gold and silver that drove European development. Right? But then you have to force peasants off the land and close. The state has always played a role in creating the market, but in terms of like the industrial growth of Germany, of Japan, of South Korea and Taiwan, of the United States, railroads, canals, the state has always played a big role in public investment. You know, it isn't like, you know, the Smithian story, Adam Smith, the state played a role, but this idea that you have a little like Puritan kind of shopkeeper who sells goods efficiently, and then he builds a little textile mill, and then he makes a lot of money, and then he builds, you know, a clothing plant, whatever. I mean, and they scrimp and save. The Protestant ethic is part of sort of, you have to force people, you have to teach people that they have to reinvest, but what they're reinvesting are socially created pools of wealth. It's not like any one individual builds capitalism. So the question then becomes, the last thing to think about is, markets are partly a means of coordinating supply and demand. That's good. But we also plan about investment. And we're not planning, hint, how to move towards alternative energy, how to get away from fossil fuel dependence. We're not planning right now, and we better. And it's kind of weird that the global capitalist class doesn't seem to be getting on top of this, though they talk about it at Davos as well. I mean, if we don't solve global warming, there may be no globe for capitalists, or no humans on the globe, for capitalists to dominate, right? I mean, hint, often it's social movements and social protests that rationalizes capitalism in a way and makes it a little more humane and a little less vicious so that capitalism can continue. Hint, it was the social movements of the 1930s that pressured FDR to save capitalism from the capitalists, right? I mean, FDR was no like radical guy, and in fact, as soon as he could, he balanced the budget in 1937. The economy went back into the toilet, only to be saved by World War II. But there were social movements that pressured, right? Lyndon Johnson was no great social democrat, but there were riots literally in our inner cities. There was union militancy. There was social protest, and he had to respond. And then, of course, the tragedy is the Great Society failed because it got killed in Vietnam, right? We started spending money on guns, then on job training, whatever. The real question right now is, if you're going to grow up in a society where you're not slaves to a market dominated by private greed and corporate capital, you may have to create sufficient unrest so that the state has to respond in ways that will make your lives more humane. I mean, it's really good to engage in social protest from below. And I'm the first person to say the Occupy is the greatest thing since sliced bread. But this spring, you have a chance to move protest politics to connect with issues of state governance and state power, because there's no solution to the student debt crisis and to the unaffordability of both public and private higher education unless we restore progressive taxation and strong public funding of not just public universities, but of federal Pell Grants, of affordable, federally subsidized loans, and unless we ultimately move towards higher education as a right. And that's not going to fall from the sky, right? The ruling class doesn't give anybody rights. This view, when you meet some hard Marxist-Leninists and they say, oh, civil rights, political rights, that's just a bunch of bourgeois rights. The bourgeoisie didn't give anybody the vote. Working people, first working class white men in Europe, had to struggle for it and win it. Then white women had to struggle for it and win it. And hint, if anybody tells you we're the land of the free, the home of the brave, this country was South African apartheid until 1965. Right? The first thing I always ask my students is, when did we become, at least on the books, we're not in reality a political democracy, we're always trying to exclude people from voting, particularly lower-income people, students, and people of color. But we didn't even become legally a political democracy until 1965. And guess what? It was only when people of color, immigrants, African Americans, began to assert themselves that ethnic immigrants who had been excluded, South European, Eastern European, whatever, who had been excluded from the American dream, but had to struggle through the Congress of Industrial Organizations in the 30s, and then died in World War II to get the fucking GI Bill. And remember this, only white GIs benefited from the GI Bill. It was the greatest affirmative action program for the white ethnic working class in history. My folks wouldn't have gone to university. Most Italo-Americans, Irish, Jewish, Slavic, whatever, Russian, would not have gone to university without the GI Bill. But when people of color try to use the state to enhance their lifetime opportunities, oh, affirmative action is horrible. What the fuck? And in many ways, this is what I'll conclude with, because in some ways this is the political terrain on which we struggle. This country, white working class people had to fight like hell to make gains. African Americans, by the way, couldn't benefit from the GI Bill, because first of all, you had to graduate from high school. And in the South, African Americans, men and women, were forced into the labor market at age 13, 14. But then you had to find an affordable university to go to, and guess what? There weren't any public universities for black people in most of the United States. Even in the North, there weren't that many places, right? But what I was going to say is, just remember that Frederick Douglass is right. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, it never will. And we can talk about, the power of capital versus the power of working people, the complex global class map in a global capitalist world, and we should talk about it. It ain't simple being a socialist. It never was, it never will be. But I would argue that the arguments against socialism, democratic socialism, are the same as the arguments against democracy. Ordinary people don't know enough. We have to be ruled by experts. We have to be ruled by people who are more knowledgeable than ourselves. If you believe in democracy, you have to believe in sort of struggling to build institutions that allow ordinary people to have as much voice as possible in the way they're governed. That doesn't mean you don't have civil servants, you don't have technical workers, you don't have scientists, but how do we democratically control these experts so that they're civil servants, they serve society? And the argument that, masses of people don't know enough, look, the vast majority of working people historically have generally voted for parties that want to give working people more opportunity. Not always. And the last thing is not always, because this is something that Northern Europe's struggling with, and the US is, and I'll conclude with this. Just as working people really began to share somewhat in capitalist prosperity through very imperfect but democratically regulated social market, mixed market, social democratic types of economies, de-industrialization came and industrial jobs moved to the developing world, which in some ways they should, but we should figure out how to make new, meaningful, high-value added jobs here. As the white working class, not just in the United States, but say in northern France, experienced this de-industrialization, even older former communist workers in France vote for Le Pen. They vote for populist parties to the right, because their world has been turned upside down, And guess what? Neither right-wing social democratic parties nor conservative parties do fuck all for them. And one of the reasons why now it is true if white men are in unions, older men, they tend to vote Democratic. But they're not in unions and they've been deindustrialized. They've bought the narrative that it's not corporate America that's fucked them by taking jobs overseas and deindustrializing Western PA, Northeastern PA, Southern Ohio, Michigan. It's that competition from immigrants and from assertive people of color is fucking them. And my tax dollars, which are raised regressively, the tax system's very regressive here. So people, resent the tax system, but they think their too high level of taxation is not because no one's telling them this, that the rich and corporations don't pay the tax levels they used to, but it's because huge amounts of money, and they're very small amounts and they're getting smaller, are taken from hard-working taxpayers and given to the indolent unemployed, right? And indolent inner city people, and it goes to them, meaning the other, meaning urban people of color. The other thing I'd say, take from this and know this fact, 45% of poor people in America are white, the largest group, and only 15% of poor people are inner city African Americans. But it's a very concentrated and intense form of poverty, and that's the image of the newspaper. But poor people in this country get totally shafted. There's no money for education, there's no money for job training, there's no money for childcare, whatever. So until we build democratic movements, and this is the essence of socialism, that say that the market and the economy should serve the democratic needs of the people, it's not the people who should serve the corporate marketplace. Until we say the economy should be democratically regulated to serve the needs of people, rather than people serving the needs of the market, the whip of the capitalist market is going to be brutal. And the only way of fighting back is to say we have to democratically control corporate power. And I will conclude with this. If you think that you can avoid dealing with the term socialist, there's lots of great organizing, labor, community, feminist, anti-student debt, that you can do without coming out of the closet. But as soon as any of those movements threaten, and we should learn from the LGBT movement that there's a damage to oneself psychologically being forced in the closet. As soon as you begin to threaten the rights of capital and be on the verge of victory, they will red bait you. They will say getting rid of student debt, that's socialism. That's letting all those lazy, indolent students who didn't get good jobs, that's moral hazard, right? People are going to start borrowing and never even paying back. Well, we're fucking past that point. We bailed out the fucking banks, right? Where was the moral hazard there? They made big mistakes, and we gave them big subsidies. But the real argument is whenever you threaten corporate power, I will tell you, and you can see this in the health insurance debate, Obama's health care plan is pretty bad, but at least it kind of promises universal coverage someday. But it got red baited, right? Because some corporations didn't really like it, because then they have to pay if they have 150 workers, and they may not like to do that. So that's socialism. I mean, socialist is fine, whatever, left hand or something. But the point is, any time a reform in the United States is on the verge of being enacted and the ruling class doesn't like it, they red bait it out of existence. And until more people say, so what's wrong with socialism? We're not even going to have humane capitalism in this country. So, look, this struggle is going to be a long and a hard one. Democracy is never an easy thing. But I can tell you, particularly if you build friendship bonds, if you work together, the rewards in struggling for social justice are also personal, right? I mean, it is a more rewarding life. But you do have to think of this as a long-distance struggle. You do have to think that you can't just be a political junkie and not care about friends and yourself. I mean, we have to do this together as a community. But I would argue that, I've been active on the socialist left since I was about 14. And, my life's better for it. So it's been a long life. But, this is really a time where you can think about commitments. And finally, many of you have real jobs and have a lot of constraints on your lives. You have demanding school. But you do have more freedom. This is a time where you can do more political stuff than you will probably in the future. Because A, you don't have to worry about, you do have to worry about the boss man if you're working part-time. Many of you are, almost full-time. But you don't yet have dependent care responsibilities for either elderly parents yet, in most cases, some of you do, for siblings or parents. And you don't have children yet, most of you, some of you may do. But, you have more freedom now than you will when your lives get more complex. If your generation isn't going to redress the horrors of global neoliberalism, of this dog-eat-dog world, of a deregulated economy, a state that is only strong in terms of police power and military power, and a state that really forces people to accept shit jobs because they have no rights to unionize. There's no right to unionize in this country. If your generation doesn't really fight back the way the generations of the 30s and the 60s did, this is going to be a long, horrible life, not just for them out there, but for you in here. This isn't just a struggle about emancipating people who are more fucked over than you are. And some of you are from middle strata backgrounds, whatever. But your generation, regardless of your class or racial background, your generation is not facing a good outlook. You can change it, as people in the 30s and 60s did, but you have to organize, and you have to fight, and you have to fight in the name of democracy. And when you fight in the name of democracy, your corporate enemies will call you what you are, socialists. So it's time to kind of try to make, without being sectarian, make the socialist kind of vision and tradition an integral part of American life. Because when America's been best, the progressive era, the 30s, the 60s, guess what? There were a lot more open socialists running around. So we may be part of a broader democratic small d tradition, but without a socialist left within that democratic tradition, the democratic tradition will not revive. So, you know, I talked too long, but my peroration is over. And we can take questions, whatever. Go ahead.
This might be a simple question. It's just about wordplay. Social democrat, democratic socialist.
Right.
Difference?
Right. Well, I think, you know, those of us who want to keep our radical bona fides would say, yeah. I mean, I think most democratic socialists, in Scandinavia, the term's used interchangeably, and not accidentally, because the Swedish in the late 70s, early 80s did put on the political agenda eventually socializing, democratizing control over capital, right? So democratic socialists would say, ultimately we're for abolishing capitalism, and we're for figuring out some sort of institutional mechanisms of giving democratic control over the workplace and over investment. And that may take various forms, workers' co-ops, certain, say, natural monopolies, state-owned industry, what's the role of the market, who should own, say, finance banks, should it be the workers at the banks, probably the state should own big financial institutions, but what combination of sort of worker ownership, small private businesses, nationally owned enterprises, say like the energy grid, whatever, and how you kind of don't just have top-down planning by bureaucrats that produces one size that fits no one, right? You know, through sort of the Soviet experience. That's a complicated question, but democratic socialists would say they're for democratizing control of capital. Social democrats generally, not always, but many social democrats, left-wing ones are democratic socialists. Moderate social democrats would generally say, this is 1956, Tony Crosland, the British Minister of Labor under the Wilson government in the 60s. Capitalism is the engine, right? And social democracy is the government that steers the engine by progressive taxation, strong public goods, occupational health and safety regulation, environmental regulation. But, you know, a democratic socialist would say that still doesn't democratize control over investment, and it really doesn't put in democratic public hands the sort of control of the future of a society, which is how we invest, sort of the surplus that we create together. So social democrats mostly would, and you know, when people say, oh, that's just, I'm a democratic socialist, but when people say, oh, social democracy in Northern Europe, it is having some trouble, but it's coming down from such a level of progressive taxation, strong public goods, not having wasteful military expenditure, probably because they pimped off the U.S. protection and NATO, but you know, strong public goods, really good public pensions. I mean, social democracy in the U.S., as much as people say, that wouldn't be very good because it's in crisis, I have Gandhi's position on Western civilization. He said, you know, when he asked, what do you think of Western civilization, Mr. Gandhi? It would be a good idea. What do you think of social democracy in America? I think it would be great if we fucking had it. Then we could fight for democratic socialism. But what does that mean? In Northern Europe, 45% of the gross domestic product is channeled through the state. In the US, only 30%. So what's the difference? A third of our 30% is wasted on incarceration and militarism. But they have universal child care, they have universal health care, and they have really good public pensions. So, you know, but to get that, you have to build union power, socialist party power. You know, you've got to build strong social movements. Capital will attack all those gains. And I think what the Mitterrand experience in France in the 80s, the social democratic experience in Scandinavia, I think in the late 70s, early 80s, democratic socialists, I think correctly said, we have strong enough unions, strong enough regulation, strong enough environmental and occupational health and safety regulation. Democratic Socialists said the same thing that capitalists did then. We can't make profit. We're getting squeezed. Labor's too strong. So Democratic Socialists said capital's going to go on strike. We better get control over capital, or else the social democratic project itself is going to be threatened. Well, Thatcher and Reagan kind of stood that analysis on its head and said, we've got to deregulate, we've got to bash unions because capital can't make profit. And they won and we lost. But we have to get to a point of sort of democratic strength and social movement strength where we're able to take on the prerogative of capital. So a long answer to your short question is probably to get to democratic socialism, you have to build the type of class power, labor power that would first get us to social democracy. I don't think, there's no reform versus revolution question in advanced post-industrial society in the sense that when somebody, it's usually a middle-class white Trotskyist who's saying this, but the first thing I say, Engels was smart enough, Engels was a smart enough dude to say in 1895, if there's civil war in Prussia, because of the level of industrial might of the Prussian army, when we split the army, it will mean the mutual ruin of the contending classes. You can have an armed insurrection in a predominantly peasant society where if you seize the urban centers, you seize state power. In this country, when somebody started talking about armed struggle, I mean, I grew up in the 60s. I have friends who were in the Panthers, who some of them were not into armed struggle, but they were in groups that talked about armed struggle. The police infiltrate you, the police start shooting you, and they kill you. Right? Fred Hampton was not armed when, as the leader of the Panthers in Chicago in 1969, he was murdered. So, when you talk about armed struggle, you better be serious. You better know what the fuck you're doing. And I always ask, do you know how to drive an M1 Abrams tank? Fucking A. We're not talking about you, whacking off in some dreamland. We're talking about it's usually a anarchist. It's usually a anarchist. It's usually a guy. Right? I'm Macho Man. Me and Che were out there. Fidel was asked in 1960, when's the armed struggle going to start in the United States? And he said, look, you don't really have a peasantry. And you don't have the Sierra Madres. Where are you going to hide? Where are you going to run to? And you got a huge military. If you don't know how to fly an F-18, don't talk to me about armed revolution. Because Enrico Berlinguer, the head of the Italian Communist Party, after Allende was overthrown, said this: in advanced, complex industrial societies, unless socialists have sufficient hegemony that non-commissioned officers in the army won't move against the democratically elected socialist government, there will not be socialism. Because, what are we going to do? I mean, also, we better build a more multiracial, more multi-class movement before we start talking about armed struggle. But what? They take out Berkeley and Ann Arbor, and then we nuke, the industrial heartland, or the de-industrialized heartland, we take out the red states. But I mean, we're not talking about play. We're talking about people's fucking lives. And guess what? It is true that the repressive power of the state is real. If you get involved in real democratic social movements, if you've ever been involved in a strike, or you've been involved in a protest, you're likely to get the shit kicked out of you at some point. And I was always in the faction in the New Left that believed that, you can't believe this, but I once weighed 150 pounds, that being able to run was more important than being able to fight. I mean, if you want to be street fighting, man, get fucking serious. But when somebody starts talking about armed struggle, this ain't, people, friends of mine who did go through armed struggle, who were in El Salvador, or Guatemala, or Nicaragua, or old friends of mine who volunteered and fought in Spain. 10% of Spain was killed in the Spanish Civil War. I mean, let's not forget that. 500,000 people in the country, 5.5 million in El Salvador died in the El Salvador Civil War. I'm not saying armed struggle isn't sometimes justifiable or necessary, particularly in really repressive countries where the armed forces just kill innocent peasants because they're indigenous or something. But, if you're really talking about armed struggle, get serious. When people talk about Marxist-Leninist Party, social democracy sucks, name one Marxist-Leninist Party who's ever done anything of significance in advanced bourgeois democracy. Workers care about civil and political rights. They fought for it. They died for it. They don't think it's just... And the successful communist parties became social democratic parties. The French Communist Party, the Italian Communist Party. I'm all for a revolution, but, I think the German left was right. A revolution in a complex post-industrial society is a long march through the institutions. I'm a revolutionary, but I'm not a sloganeer. I'm not just going to say armed struggle. Fucking armed struggle. I mean, I can't even shoot a Colt 45. Let's get serious. All right, I'm done with mine.
So I'm a guy who you call a revolutionist revolutionary socialist last night. I guess my point wasn't that social democracy wouldn't make people's lives better. I mean, clearly it's better in Europe than here. The question, you said yourself that these institutions in the welfare state are often meant to mollify the people. So the question is, if people get reforms and that mollifies the movement, and then those reforms will be dismantled by capital, and it seems like a rinse and repeat cycle.
I mean, that's a serious, I mean, that's a serious question. And at that level, I shouldn't have taken a swipe at you. But I mean, I think partly I have Piven's argument, which is that I hope we have those problems of reforms that improve people's lives, possibly mollifying them. It cuts both ways. Usually victories, anybody who's done community organizing, why do you pick a target that you can win initially? Because victories usually empower people and make them demand more. You know, once you win a victory on a campus and you prove you can defeat the administration is afraid of you motherfuckers. If you lose and you don't win shit, guess what? I mean, the Reagan years sucked. You know, and don't worry, you want to get rid of Occupy? Occupy is probably that Obama promised he'd improve the world and he didn't deliver. Right? And we're disillusioned and we're pissed. But guess what? The right wing's going to say, we believe poor people inevitably should be poor. We believe unions should have no rights. You want to experiment again? I remember arguing with people. I actually worked for Barry Commoner in 1980. I did not support Jimmy Carter. And my friends, some of them came out from further left, who said, you better suck it up, vote for Carter, because it'll be better to struggle against Carter than against Reagan. They were right, and I was wrong, and I should apologize. Right? I'm not saying that, right? That's the joke about Trotsky. You know, you ever hear this joke? You should know this. This is part of your socialist legacy. Right? This little Jewish guy comes to the party convention in 1929 and delivers a message from Comrade Trotsky. And it says, I was wrong, you were right, I should apologize. And Stalin says, Comrade Trotsky has capitulated. He just sent me this letter. I was wrong, you were right, I should apologize. And the little Jewish comment says, no, you do not understand. Lev Davidovich Abramovich, that's Trotsky's original name, Bronstein. He is of my culture. You did not read it right. I was wrong? You're right? I should apologize? Sorry, go ahead. So what I just did want to say, I think you're right, though, that in a certain sense, that's why you never should demobilize. And that's why I think democratic socialists, and here I would differ somewhat through social democrats, whatever. We should build political parties, whether it's third party, working for progressive Democrats, whatever, but you always have to have pressure from below. And you always have to have, if you want to use old left terms, an extra parliamentary movement, and also a movement that's somewhat suspicious that, look, we not only want a democratic welfare state, we want a democratic society, and we want to de-bureaucratize. We need state funding to have decent schools and stuff, but we want community control, we want community health clinics. We don't just want a bureaucratic, paternalistic welfare state. But that criticism meant more when we did have a bureaucratic, paternalistic welfare state. Once we get a bureaucratic, paternalistic, you know, we should always be fighting. But I think you're right. I mean, you can never, liberation will not be delivered by a bunch of bourgeois or social democratic politicians. And the fact is, even when you have strong left-wing socialist parties, they often have to deal with capital, and you got to resist. Go ahead. Well, why don't people say their names, by the way? I'm Joe, and I teach at Temple. Do you know?
Grad student at Rockefeller University.
Okay. Oh, so you're a scientist.
Yeah.
Oh. My sister got a PhD in philosophy there, and then they got rid of philosophy.
My name is Patricia, and I'm from Georgetown. You talked a little bit about alternative energy sources and the environment. Can we just talk a little bit more about the environmental facet of socialism?
Yeah.
Because environmental harmony is like primordial to social harmony.
Right. I mean, I think there is, and this is a good and big question, there is somewhat a sort of materialist or productivist tendency to Marxism, that technology will solve everything, and kind of socialist GE, there used to be man, General Electric's brings good things to light. It was like, well, Lenin says this, if we put in our technocrats, you know, industry will work for all the workers. And I think there are certain ecological limits to growth, probably. But where I'm somewhat, I don't know if this makes me Marxist, I don't see any, I think you need technological solutions to problems and political solutions, and technology is political, to problems that technology and industry and politics has caused. So I do think we're going to, I don't see how we get alternative energy, you know, we get movement away from fossil fuel unless it really is massive public investment in, say, solar and wind and building. We need an alternative grid, right? And corporations aren't going to build a grid. So, you know, but put it this way, I don't think there's one socialist answer to the environmental crisis, and I think that's something we ought to talk about, and we probably don't talk about it enough, partly because we're not on the verge of changing energy and, you know, corporate investment policy, but it is a real serious issue. And, you know, I can see people arguing that the ecological crisis is so threatening that that's what we should primarily organize around. The tension is, of course, that people have, one of the reasons why we don't have real changes, people who have immediate material needs often can't afford to talk about environment. It's one of the reasons why, not totally, there's a big environmental justice, anti-racist, urban, you know, multiracial environmental justice movement. But environmental issues often are for people who are fairly secure economically. But I think you have to work on both ends. You have to deal with people's material needs, but also provide for them in a way that doesn't destroy the environment.
But that's why I think that you need kind of a more redistributed nature.
Well,
just because you can't, there's a cap to growth.
Right,
you can't
right.
just be socialist and be like, okay, we can
Right.
still keep growing because there are material limits.
Well, no, I think, look, we ought to talk about qualitative, you know, well-being, not gross domestic product, not more. Yeah, there's a lot of waste in all forms of late industrial society, communist and capitalist. Yeah, and I think, you know, right. On the other hand, one has to be careful that some people really do need more food, better housing. You know, a lot of people do have real material needs. And if the environmental movement or the left looks like it isn't aware of that. You know, people who don't have indoor plumbing, I mean, I once debated, what's his face, Zurza, the leading primitivist, right, hunter-gatherer society. No, I did it, John Zurza. And I said, you know, people don't have once people get indoor plumbing, they don't go back to shitting in outhouses. I mean, there is something to Marx's view that once people experience new needs, they don't go backwards. And fucking hey, I've lived in the woods for 6 weeks, you know, middle-class kid camping and shit, you know. But, shit, I mean, you know, my view, I think most people, if they can hike in beautiful areas and then take a shower in a Motel 6, in a People's Motel 6, that's yeah, whatever. But anyway, he also said that hunter-gatherers would want to solve inner-city problems, and I said, I don't think people are begging to get, you know, flint arrows so they can kill squirrels. You know, they want to have decent vegetables. And that's
I'm Matt from Worcester. Going back to what you're talking about with children growing up in poverty and ending up in poverty, I was just wondering, was there a distinction between the real number in European countries? Because you said 4%, but didn't distinguish if that was an accurate number and then measured against the American.
Yeah, I mean, usually European poverty levels, you know, what the government considers poor is usually higher in terms of sort of quality of life, consumption, whatever. But look, it is certainly true. Let's not kid ourselves. There's tremendous class inequality, even in the most social democratic countries. What is true, though, is the United States now does have, that's the other myth, we have the lowest rates of social mobility, even compared to Britain. Basically, if you're born in the bottom quintile now, it's about a 60% chance you'll end up in the bottom quintile. And if you're a male, white or black or Latino, about 80%, because there are no good industrial jobs, there's no good inner city education, whatever. It's about half that in most of North Europe, and it's only about 20% of people born in the bottom quintile in Scandinavia end up there. But you have to remember, in a class society, we're all obsessed with social mobility. If you still have classes, some people are going up, other people are going down. The question is there a rising tide that's lifting all boats? But yeah, I mean, I think, but basically, without going into statistics, if you have universal child care and you have universal health care, you have much less intense poverty. The reason why many women, they can't even get temporary aid to needy families, but American jobs don't pay enough. Low-wage jobs for one person doesn't pay enough to pay for child care. We don't have enough public money for child care. So a lot of people are forced to choose, particularly if they're, you know, and then we have workfare. You get a little subsidy, temporary aid, and you have to show up 30 hours a week to make work or look for a job. And then your kid gets sick. They can't go to this inadequately state-funded child care. You lose your TANF. To show how horrible this country is, we started 12.5 million women and children were on welfare at the time of Clinton's welfare reform. We threw people off the rolls. Some of them got jobs in the growing economy. Most of them did it. There were 4.7 million people, women and children, on TANF, temporary aid to the family, in 2008 when the recession started. There were only 5 million. It's only because you can't get on in those states. You know, they make the incredible work requirements, they don't let you on, they drug test you, whatever. 7.5 million people, including 5 million children in this country, up from about 2.5 million before the recession, it's estimated their only source of income is food stamps. They live with families, they live with relatives, they go from house to house, they're homeless for 3 months, they live in their cars, whatever. If we're the great wealthiest society in the world, that's a crime against humanity. I mean, that really is. So should we take one more?
We gotta go.
Oh, we gotta go. All right. Sorry.